London, 1888. The fog rolls thick over cobblestone streets. Gas lamps flicker weakly, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls of narrow alleys. A carriage wheel splashes through a pool of filthy water, but no one dares to look up. Somewhere, in the darkness, a scream cuts the silence, then vanishes into the mist. This is not the London of polished manners, glittering ballrooms, or fine silk gowns. This is a city of hunger, corruption, and secrets so dark they were buried for decades. Behind the shining facades of Parliament and Buckingham Palace, another London existed, one of crime, poverty, and hidden horrors that polite society pretended not to see. And tonight, we're taking you there. But beware. What you're about to discover is not just history. It's a descent into a world where the line between survival and damnation was razor thin. And sometimes, even the most innocent-looking street could swallow you whole. By the time we reach the final secret, you'll understand why many Victorians whispered that the devil himself walked the streets of London. The shadow of Whitechapel pictured the East End of London in the late 1800s. A maze of crooked streets, foul-smelling gutters, and houses packed so tightly you could hear the coughs of strangers through paper-thin walls. This was Whitechapel, the beating heart of misery. By day, the neighborhood swarmed with barefoot children begging for bread, women selling scraps of lace or matches, and men stumbling home after drinking away the day's meager earnings. By night, it transformed into something far darker, where shadows seemed to move with minds of their own. At its core, Whitechapel was a place where desperation ruled every decision. Families of 8 or 10 crammed into single rooms. Rats gnawed on whatever they could find, and disease stalked the alleys as faithfully as the lamplighters. Poverty wasn't the only plague. Crime wrapped its fingers around the district like a noose. Pickpockets, burglars, and hustlers prowled the corners, waiting for the right moment to strike. If you lost a coin, you might as well have kissed it goodbye. But worse than theft were the gangs, roving packs of men who controlled whole streets. With knives tucked in their belts and iron bars hidden under coats, they ruled by fear, and the police dared not step too far into their territory. For women, survival meant choices that polite society found unmentionable. Many were forced into the streets, offering their bodies for pennies just to keep their children from starving. Each night, they walked into the fog knowing they might not walk back out. And it was here, in this crucible of desperation, that one of history's most infamous killers struck. He was never caught, never named with certainty, but his shadow has haunted Whitechapel for over a century. The world would come to know him as Jack the Ripper, and his reign of terror was only possible because of the darkness that already choked the East End. Imagine the sound of his victims' footsteps echoing on wet stones, the quickened breath as they turned down an alley too narrow to escape. The fog made it impossible to see who was following, and when the knife flashed, no one heard the final cry. Newspapers spread the horror across London, but behind the sensational headlines, the true terror was whispered, that anyone could be next. The Ripper wasn't just a killer. He was a symbol of a city that had abandoned its purse to fate. The murders forced London to confront what it tried so hard to ignore, that thousands lived in conditions so dire they could disappear overnight, and no one would notice until the police found a body. Whitechapel became the mirror of Victorian hypocrisy. While the wealthy held balls under chandeliers, the poor fought for scraps in squalid lodging houses, where death from hunger was as common as death from disease. In the heart of this misery, fear became currency. Parents warned children not to stray after dark, but in truth, daylight was no safer. The real danger was not one man with a knife, It was a society that let entire neighborhoods rot. Journalists, reformers, and do-gooders poured into Whitechapel after the killings, clutching notebooks and sketching the horrors they found. Yet for many, these tours of misery were little more than morbid entertainment. Some said the killings were a punishment for sin. Others whispered they were the work of demons. The truth was simpler and crueler. When poverty is deep enough, monsters don't have to hide. They walk in plain sight. And so, Whitechapel was left scarred. The Ripper murders ended, but the suffering continued, grinding on long after the headlines faded. For every victim remembered by name, countless more vanished into unmarked graves, their stories lost to the fog. They were the forgotten children of London's darkest quarter. Yet one question lingered, whispered in hushed voices, long after the gas lamps dimmed. Was Jack the Ripper truly gone? Or had the East End merely hidden him among the faceless crowds once more? The workhouse horrors. Imagine you're cold, starving, and penniless on a winter night in Victorian London. Snow crunches beneath your broken shoes, your stomach twists with hunger, and every doorway you try is locked. There's only one place left to go, the workhouse. But stepping inside was not salvation. It was surrender to the desperate poor. The workhouse promised food and shelter. But once the heavy doors closed, it became something else entirely. A prison disguised as charity. The system was designed not to help, but to break the spirit of anyone who entered. Families were torn apart at the threshold. Husbands, wives, and children separated by force. A mother who begged for food would watch her children dragged down a different corridor, their cries echoing as she was pushed the other way. For many, that moment was the last time they ever saw each other. Inside, every corner reeked of disinfectant and despair. Iron beds lined the walls, thin straw mattresses crawling with lice. Windows were barred, and silence was enforced like law. Even whispers could bring punishment. Food was barely fit for animals. A ladle of gruel, a crust of stale bread, sometimes a lump of suet pudding swimming in grease. Meals weren't meant to nourish. They were meant to humiliate, reminding inmates they were beggars in the eyes of the state. Workhouses didn't just house the poor, they exploited them. Men spent endless hours breaking stones or picking oakum, tearing apart old ship ropes with bleeding fingers until their nails split and skin shredded. Women scrubbed laundry until their knuckles swelled, stitched clothing by candlelight until their eyes burned, or scoured endless floors until they could no longer stand. Every task was designed to crush dignity, not build futures. Children were no exception. Some as young as 5 were put to work, spinning wool, sweeping chimneys, or scrubbing corridors too tall for their small arms. Childhood was stolen in exchange for survival. The cruelty was deliberate. Victorian society believed poverty was a moral failing, a sin that needed punishment. If life in the workhouse was made harsh enough, they thought, the poor would be scared into working harder outside. But how could they? Many who entered were already broken, orphans, widows, the sick, the disabled. For them, the workhouse wasn't a second chance. It was a slow death sentence wrapped in brick walls and iron gates. Diseases spread like wildfire in the cramped dormitories. Tuberculosis, cholera, and typhus thrived in the damp, crowded air. A single cough could spark an outbreak that claimed dozens of lives within days. Death was so common that workhouses had their own mortuaries. Bodies were stacked in cold rooms until they could be carted away, often buried in mass graves with no names, no prayers, and no mourners. For those who survived, the scars were not only physical. Stories tell of children who forgot their mothers' faces, of men who left the workhouse unable to speak, and of women who came out broken shells of who they once were. Journalists of the time who sneaked inside described scenes that shook even hardened readers. Skeletal figures bent over endless labor, women sobbing in silence, and the hollow-eyed children who looked more like ghosts than the living. Charles Dickens, who knew poverty himself, immortalized these horrors in his writings. Through stories like Oliver Twist, he showed readers the truth, that the workhouse was not mercy, but a machine of suffering. Yet despite the outrage his story stirred, the system did not vanish. It grew, swallowing more of London's poor as industrialization left thousands jobless and broken. The workhouses became factories of despair, and as the century wore on, whispers spread among the poor. Sometimes it was better to starve in the streets than to enter those cursed walls, for inside, the living envied the dead. So when you picture Victorian London, don't just imagine the glitter of wealth or the elegance of society. Remember the hidden prisons of poverty, the workhouses, where hope was stripped away, one soul at a time. And somewhere within those walls, darker secrets waited still, the deadly sewers beneath the city, beneath the grand streets of Victorian London. Far below the carriages and polished shoes lay a hidden world, a world of tunnels, darkness, and stench so thick it could make the strongest stomach heave. These were the sewers, vast, winding veins of the city, carrying away more than just waste. To step into them was to step into another reality. The air was damp, heavy with rot, and the sound of trickling water echoed endlessly. But water wasn't the only thing that flowed here. Disease, death, and secrets drifted through the tunnels as easily as rats. Before the great engineering works of Joseph Bazalgette, London's sewers were a nightmare. Raw sewage poured directly into the River Thames, turning it into a churning ribbon of filth. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was lethal. Every tide carried death into the heart of the city. Cholera spread like fire, striking down thousands at a time. People drank from pumps that pulled water straight from the poisoned river, never realizing their glass was filled with sickness. The stench grew so unbearable that in the summer of 1858, Parliament itself could not escape. The air around Westminster reeked so badly that curtains were soaked in lime chloride just to mask the smell. The newspapers called it the Great Stink, but beyond the horror of disease and stench, the sewers became something else, a refuge for crime. Pickpockets, burglars, and smugglers learned the secret routes, vanishing beneath the city like phantoms. Police feared chasing criminals into the underground labyrinth. The tunnels were pitch black, slippery, and filled with sudden drops. A single wrong step could mean being swallowed by rushing currents, never to resurface. Rat catchers also roamed these depths. Armed with nets and cages, they hunted the swarms of vermin that thrived in the filth. Some caught hundreds in a single night, selling them for sport in rat-fighting pits above ground. But the sewers held darker things than rats. There were tales whispered of bodies dumped into the tunnels, murder victims, unwanted infants, and corpses too inconvenient for the surface. Many were carried away by the flow, lost forever. Sometimes, workers clearing blockages stumbled upon skulls wedged in brickwork, or skeletons tangled in roots where the water slowed. Each discovery raised the same chilling question: who had they been, and who wanted them forgotten? In some districts, children dared each other to explore the underground. Few returned without scars. They spoke of strange lights flickering in the distance, of footsteps that followed when no one was there, of shadows moving against the walls. Others claimed the sewers carried voices. Low, guttural sounds echoed from the darkness, sometimes mistaken for demons. In truth, It was often gangs marking their territory, or something worse lurking unseen. The most terrifying threat was invisible. Miasma, the Victorians believed, seeped from the filth and poisoned the lungs. Though they were wrong about its nature, they were right about the danger. Breathing that air was a death sentence. Engineers who worked in the depths often fell sick, coughing blood after just a few weeks underground. Some drowned in sudden floods, their bodies found days later washed up on the banks of the Thames. Yet even with its horrors, the sewer became essential to London's survival. Without it, the city would have drowned in its own waste. With it, new nightmares simply found a place to hide. Bazalgette's grand redesign eventually transformed the system into a marvel of engineering. But the ghosts of the old sewers remained, both in memory and, some said, in truth. There are still stories of workers hearing whispers in the tunnels, of shadows that don't belong, and of finding bones where none should be. The past never fully flushed away. It lingers, rotting quietly in the dark. And as you walk London's modern streets, know this: beneath your feet, the same labyrinth still stretches for miles, carrying with it the whispers of the forgotten, the stench of death, and the secrets the city never meant you to find. The opium dens of Limehouse in the shadow of the East End docks, where sailors from every corner of the world unloaded their cargo. Another kind of trade flourished. Not gold, not spices, not silk. This was Limehouse, the district where dreams were smoked into oblivion. By day, Limehouse bustled with ship workers, hawkers, and the cries of merchants. But as night fell, the narrow streets twisted into something sinister. Doors creaked open to dark rooms lit only by dim lanterns, and a strange, sweet smoke drifted into the air. These were the opium dens, places whispered about in polite society, but seldom spoken of openly. Inside, men and women lay sprawled across wooden bunks, pipes dangling from limp fingers, their eyes half shut in a trance between life and death. The air was thick, heavy with the bitter, sweet smell of burning opium. For newcomers, it burned the throat. For the addicted, it was paradise. The first drag sent them drifting into a haze where hunger, fear, and poverty no longer existed. The dens were run by shadowy figures, often immigrants who knew the trade well. Chinese sailors were blamed for introducing the drug, but in truth, the demand came from Londoners themselves, desperate souls eager to escape their brutal reality. Men ruined by gambling debts came here. Women broken by poverty sought escape in the smoke. Even gentlemen from the West End, dressed in fine suits, slipped secretly into Limehouse, their carriages waiting outside while they poisoned themselves in the dark. Some smoked to forget, others smoked to disappear, and many never left. It was said a man could enter a den in the evening, take his first taste, and never see daylight again. His body left to rot in a back room, quietly removed and forgotten. The dens had a rhythm of their own. The low hiss of pipes, the shuffle of bodies as one dreamer fell and another took his place, and the occasional cough that broke through the silence. It was less a gathering than a mass surrender of souls. Outside, Londoners gossiped about what really went on inside. Tales spread of secret cults, of strange rituals performed under the influence, of women sold into slavery while stupefied by smoke. Few could separate truth from legend, but the mystery only deepened the fear. The police raided the dens occasionally, dragging out half-conscious figures into the cold night. But just as quickly as one den was closed, another opened down the street. The demand was endless, and the profit too great to resist. Writers and journalists flocked to Limehouse, eager to capture the strange, exotic horror of it all. They described smoky rooms filled with shadows, men who looked more dead than alive, and the eerie silence that clung to the dens like a shroud. Charles Dickens hinted at them in his later works. Arthur Conan Doyle brought them vividly to life in Sherlock Holmes stories, painting them as layers of vice and mystery. For readers, the opium dens became symbols of London's hidden rot, yet behind the sensational tales was a deeper tragedy. Addiction gripped the poor like chains, dragging whole families into ruin. Children were left starving as parents spent their last coins on smoke. Homes were abandoned, futures destroyed, and still, the dens thrived. For in a city where workhouses broke bodies and the streets bred hunger, opium offered something nothing else could: escape, even if it was only for a few stolen hours. But escape had a price. The more one smoked, the more the body demanded. Soon, the haze turned to weakness, the weakness to sickness, and the sickness to death. And the dens kept claiming victims, one puff at a time. Sailors carried stories of men who wasted away inside, their skin pale, their teeth rotted, their eyes sunken into skulls. Some said the dens were not houses of escape at all, but graveyards in disguise. To this day, the legend of Limehouse lingers in London's memory. Though the dens are gone, their ghostly reputation remains, a reminder of the city's hunger for both escape and oblivion. And as the smoke clears from the opium haze, we move to another secret, one even darker, where the dead themselves were stolen from their graves and sold on London's black market. The rat catchers and body snatchers. London in the 1800s was a city crawling with rats. They scurried through the sewers, gnawed at food stalls, and darted across filthy alleyways. To the poor, rats were a daily terror, but to others, they were a business. Rat catchers roamed the streets, carrying sacks, writhing with squealing cargo. For a fee, they promised to rid homes and taverns of infestations. But not every rat they caught was killed. Many were kept alive because rats had another, more sinister use. In hidden cellars and smoky taverns, men gathered for a gruesome sport, rat baiting. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of rats were released into a pit where dogs were set upon them. Spectators roared as the animals tore through the swarm, blood splattering the floor. Money changed hands quickly, bets placed on how many rats a dog could kill within minutes. To keep the trade alive, rat catchers supplied the pits endlessly, feeding a cruel entertainment industry that thrived in the shadows of polite society. But while rat catchers dealt in vermin, others trafficked in something far worse. Beneath London's respectable surface lurked a trade that sent shivers even through the most hardened criminals. Body snatching. Medical schools were booming in Victorian London. Surgeons needed cadavers to study, to teach, to practice their craft. But the law permitted only a tiny number of bodies, usually executed criminals, to be dissected. The demand far outstripped supply, and so a new black market emerged. Resurrection men, as they were called, dug up fresh graves under cover of night, hauling corpses from the earth to sell to anatomy schools for a quick profit. Imagine the horror of a grieving family returning to a cemetery only to find the earth disturbed, the coffin broken, and their loved one gone. The dead, once thought safe in eternal rest, were no longer safe at all. Graveyards became battlegrounds. Families hired guards to watch over fresh burials. Iron cages, known as mort safes, were locked over graves. In some churchyards, mourners took turns sitting vigil with lanterns until the body was too decayed to be useful. The resurrection men worked fast. A skilled crew could strip a grave in under an hour, dragging the body out by ropes, stripping it of clothing, because the law punished theft of clothes, not the corpse itself, and selling it still warm to waiting surgeons. The trade was dangerous. Angry mobs sometimes caught the body snatchers red-handed, beating them bloody before hauling them to the police. Yet the profits were so great that many kept returning to the graveyards, night after night. Rumors spread that not all the bodies came from graves. Some whispered of murders committed solely to supply the anatomy schools. The infamous Burke and Hare killings in Edinburgh, where living victims were suffocated and sold, haunted Londoners with a thought that their city might harbor similar monsters. For surgeons, the trade was a double-edged sword. They needed the bodies, but they also knew the public hated them for it. Some claimed not to ask questions about where cadavers came from, turning a blind eye to the dirty business beneath their profession. Journalists exposed the scandal, printing lurid tales of midnight raids, hidden wagons filled with corpses, and anatomy theaters echoing with the sound of scalpels slicing into stolen flesh. Each story fed public fury, yet the demand never stopped. To the poor, body snatching was a final insult. It was not enough that they lived in hunger and misery. They now feared they would not even be allowed to rest in peace after death. The grave itself had become unsafe. Eventually, the Anatomy Act of 1832 sought to end the trade, allowing medical schools to use unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals. But this only deepened the cruelty, because now it was the poorest of the poor, the forgotten, who filled the dissecting tables. The resurrection men faded from the cemeteries, but their legend lingered. Every disturbed grave, every whisper of missing corpses, reminded Londoners of a time when the city's dead were as vulnerable as the living. And so, in the shadows of rat pits and anatomy schools, London revealed its most chilling truth. In the hunger for entertainment and knowledge, nothing was sacred, not even the grave. But as bodies were stolen from the earth, the city above was poisoned by something even more insidious. The River Thames itself, the Thames of death. The River Thames has always been London's lifeblood. By day, its waters shimmered with the reflection of church spires and bridges. By night, its currents carried the glow of gas lamps along its banks. But in Victorian times, the river was not just a symbol of beauty, it was a graveyard. To look at the Thames in the 1800s was to look upon poison. Human waste, factory chemicals, slaughterhouse blood, and rotting animal carcasses poured into it daily. By the mid-century, the river had become a slow-moving sewer, black and foul-smelling. Fishermen abandoned its banks. Ferrymen coughed as they rowed across. Even hardened dockworkers gagged at the stench that rolled up from the water. Yet thousands still lived and worked by its side, trapped in a city that depended on its deadly flow. Disease was the river's most relentless weapon. Every gulp of water drawn from it carried cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. Families who believed they were drinking life were, in truth, drinking their own death. Outbreaks came in waves. In 1832, cholera claimed thousands in just weeks. Again in 1848, and again in 1854. The disease swept through London like fire. Entire streets were emptied as bodies piled high in overcrowded cemeteries. The poor suffered most. Their homes sat closest to the water, their wells dug shallow into poisoned ground, while the wealthy imported bottled water. The poor swallowed the river's filth and paid with their lives. The tragedy reached Parliament itself in the summer of 1858. The air grew so unbearable, thick with the stench of raw sewage, that lawmakers fled their chambers. It was the infamous Great Stink, when even the rulers of the empire could no longer ignore the river of death flowing past their windows. But disease and stench were only part of the story. The Thames also became the city's most secret grave. Its dark waters swallowed countless victims, some by accident, many by design. Suicides were tragically common. Desperate mothers, abandoned by husbands and unable to feed their children, walked into the river's embrace at night. Men, ruined by debt, vanished beneath its surface. For the destitute, the Thames was both an end and an escape. Crime, too, left its mark on the water. Bodies of the murdered were dumped into its depths, their faces unrecognizable when the currents finally returned them to shore. The river was both accomplice and witness to London's darkest deeds. Coroners along the banks worked endlessly, pulling corpses from the water week after week. Sometimes they were identified. Often they were not. Anonymous men, women, and children were buried in paupers' graves, their names never spoken again. Even the river itself became a weapon. Gang members used it to send messages, binding rivals in chains and tossing them into the current. The Thames whispered threats in its murky flow, a warning to all who crossed the wrong men. Children scavenged along the banks, searching for scraps of coal, wood, or rope carried by the tide. But they also stumbled upon bloated corpses, limbs tangled in reeds, or skulls washed clean by the current. The river gave gifts, but never without a curse. Journalists described it in chilling detail. They called the Thames a pestilential ditch and a stream of living death. Yet still, barges moved across it, and lovers strolled along its banks, as if pretending not to hear the whispers from its depths. For many Victorians, the river became a symbol of London itself, grand and powerful on the surface, but hiding filth and corruption beneath. It was the perfect reflection of a city where glittering wealth and crushing poverty lived side by side. Salvation finally came in the form of engineering. Joseph Bazalgette's new sewer system redirected waste, cleansing the river of its worst poisons. But though the water grew cleaner, the memories of death could never be washed away. Even today, divers and workers along the Thames still discover skeletons hidden in its mud, silent reminders of the countless souls it claimed in the Victorian age. Each bone unearthed is a story unfinished, a life cut short, and so the Thames flowed on, carrying both the pride of an empire and the shame of its dead. But as the river claimed the forgotten, another London horror emerged above its banks, one that preyed not on the dead, but on the city's most vulnerable living. Its children of the streets. Picture a child of 7, barefoot, shivering in the fog, clutching a half-broken broom in one hand and an empty stomach in the other. This was no rare sight in Victorian London. Tens of thousands of children grew up not in homes, but on the streets. They were called street Arabs, not because of their heritage, but because society saw them as outsiders, wanderers, creatures of the gutter. To most Londoners, they were invisible until they stole a loaf of bread or begged too loudly outside a tavern. By dawn, these children were already at work. Some polished boots for pennies, others sold flowers, matches, or scraps of newspapers. Many carried baskets heavier than themselves, weaving between horses and carriages in a city that barely noticed their existence. Hunger was their constant companion. A crust of bread, a bruised apple, or scraps stolen from market stalls were treasures worth fighting over. Some children gnawed on bones dogs had left behind, while others drank water straight from the poisoned Thames. At night, the city offered no safety. They huddled in doorways, under bridges, or in the corners of filthy lodging houses. Blankets were a luxury. Most slept wrapped in their own thin arms, listening to the rats scurry around them. Disease thrived among them. Measles, smallpox, and tuberculosis cut through the young faster than through adults. Without doctors or medicine, a cough could turn into a death sentence. Many never lived to see adulthood. For those who survived, crime often became the only path forward. Gangs of child pickpockets roamed the streets, trained by older criminals to slip purses from pockets or snatch handkerchiefs from passing gentlemen. Girls faced an even darker fate. Many, barely into their teens, were lured or forced into prostitution. They disappeared into the back alleys of Whitechapel or the dim rooms of brothels. Their childhoods traded for survival in a city that treated them as disposable. The police hunted these children relentlessly. For stealing bread, they were beaten. For sleeping rough, they were jailed. Some were sent to reform schools, grim places where cruelty was disguised as discipline. Others were shipped overseas as labor, torn from the city entirely. Yet despite their suffering, the children developed a toughness that shocked outsiders. They fought for scraps, defended their corners, and outwitted the constables who tried to catch them. For many, survival was their only education. Charles Dickens brought them to life in his novels. Oliver Twist, The Artful Dodger, Tiny Tim. But for every character readers pitied on the page, thousands more lived and died without a name, without a story, without a chance. Journalists of the time wrote of children sleeping six to a bed in stinking doss houses, of babies left crying in gutters, of young boys carrying corpses for undertakers just to earn enough for supper. Each story peeled back another layer of horror. Charities tried to help, orphanages opened, missions handed out soup, and reformers fought to pass child labor laws. But the need was too great, the poverty too deep. For every child saved, a dozen more slipped back into the shadows. Some children became legends of their own. Tales spread of fearless pickpocket gangs who defied police, or chimney sweeps who vanished into houses only to reappear with pockets stuffed full of stolen goods. They were both villains and victims in the city's eyes, yet behind the bravado lay brokenness. Many were orphans, their parents claimed by disease, prison, or the workhouse. Others had been abandoned, cast off as mouths too costly to feed. Their only family was the street itself. Death came early and often. The newspapers spoke of tiny coffins lowered into paupers' graves, row after row of forgotten children. Their names rarely appeared in records. Their stories ended before they had even begun. To the Victorians, these children were both a problem and a shameful secret. They symbolized the rot at the heart of the empire, a reminder that beneath the wealth and progress, the city was failing its most innocent. And so, the children of the streets became ghosts of London, haunting its alleys and marketplaces, reminding all who looked closely that beneath the empire's pride lay a tragedy too vast to count. But if children starved above ground, another horror thrived in the hidden rooms where the poor gathered to sleep. The cursed lodging houses. The cursed lodging houses when the streets grew too cold and the bridges too dangerous. The poor of Victorian London turned to the lodging houses. For a few pennies, a man or woman could rent a bed or something that passed for one, in a place where walls leaned, ceilings sagged, and the air stank of sweat and despair. From the outside, these houses looked ordinary enough. Crooked brick buildings squeezed between taverns and shops. But once you stepped inside, the truth became clear. The walls seemed to sweat with damp. Floors creaked under the weight of too many feet, and every corner hid a story of misery. Some offered beds, thin planks of wood with a scrap of straw, crammed together so tightly that strangers slept cheek to cheek. Others were even crueler. Fourpenny coffins, long wooden boxes where the poor lay like corpses, their bodies stacked in rows, paying to practice death before it claimed them. For those who couldn't afford a box, there were the 2-penny hangovers. A rope stretched across the room, and the desperate were allowed to drape themselves over it, sleeping half upright until morning. When the keeper cut the rope at dawn, the bodies slumped to the floor like rag dolls. The air inside was foul. Dozens of unwashed bodies pressed together, coughing, snoring, groaning in the dark. Fleas crawled across the straw. Lice spread from head to head, and the stench of gin, sweat, and sickness filled every breath. Privacy was impossible. A thief could cut the coins from your pocket as you slept, or worse, many awoke to find their shoes gone, their coats stolen, and their last meal taken from under their heads. Violence was common. Arguments over pennies or space turned into fights with knives. The lodging house keepers rarely intervened. They cared only for the coins in their box, not the blood on their floors. Disease thrived in these cursed houses. Tuberculosis rattled through the rooms like a drumbeat, claiming victim after victim. Typhus swept entire streets, where the lodging houses were packed tightest, leaving coffins piled in churchyards. Children were not spared. Mothers brought their infants to these houses, rocking them to sleep amid the coughing and shouting. Many of those babies never saw their first birthdays, their lungs too small to survive the poisoned air. Prostitutes worked openly in the lodging houses, renting beds by the hour. For some women, it was the only way to afford a night indoors. For others, it was the path to ruin, disease, abuse, and death waiting behind every door. The houses became breeding grounds for crime. Pickpockets, burglars, and highwaymen shared beds with the homeless and the helpless. Plans were whispered in the dark, and more than one robbery began in the stinking corners of a lodging house. Journalists who ventured inside wrote with horror. They described rooms so crowded that men slept standing, leaning on one another like corpses propped in a morgue. They wrote of children with hollow eyes, of women beaten by drunken men, of the living indistinguishable from the dead. Reformers begged for change, demanding inspections and closures. But the houses multiplied, fed by endless poverty. As long as the poor needed shelter, the keepers had customers, and no law could stop the business of misery. Some whispered that the houses were cursed. Those who slept in them too long never rose again, not just from disease, but from despair. They lost the will to fight, to hope, to live. The lodging houses swallowed them whole. For many Londoners, these houses were invisible. The wealthy passed by without ever stepping inside, never smelling the rot, never hearing the cries. The suffering remained hidden, contained behind closed doors, as if the city itself wanted to forget. Yet for the poor, the lodging house was inescapable. It was both prison and sanctuary, both roof and coffin, a place where you paid to be reminded that life was as cheap as a handful of pennies. And when morning came, the doors creaked open, and the poor spilled back onto the streets, carrying the stink of the night with them. They blended once more into London's endless tide of beggars, hawkers, and thieves, invisible until night drove them back to their cursed shelters. The lodging houses of London were more than homes of the desperate. They were factories of misery, feeding death into the city 1 penny at a time. But beyond these cursed walls, another shadow lurked in the alleys. The secret brotherhoods of gangs who ruled the streets with fists, blades, and fear. Victorian London's secret gangs by day. Victorian London's streets bustled with carriages, merchants, and chatter. But when the sun dipped below the rooftops, another London emerged. One ruled not by the law, but by gangs. They were the true kings of the alleys, and their kingdom was built on fear. These were not petty pickpockets or lone thieves. They were organized brotherhoods bound by loyalty, blood, and violence. Whole neighborhoods fell under their control, where every shopkeeper paid tribute and every stranger was watched. One of the most notorious were the Elephant and Castle Gang, whose members prowled the South London streets armed with blades and cudgels. They struck like shadows, robbing and beating anyone who wandered unguarded into their territory. In Clerkenwell and Bethnal Green, the scuttlers made their mark. They dressed sharp, scarves tied at the neck, peaked caps pulled low, and fought brutal turf wars with rival gangs. For them, violence wasn't just business, it was identity. Knives flashed in the alleys, razors sliced in the dark, and brass knuckles shattered bones. Police patrols were too few, too weak, and too afraid to step deep into gang territory. More than once, an entire patrol was beaten back by a mob of boys barely in their teens. Gangs didn't just fight each other. They infiltrated London's taverns, gambling dens, and lodging houses. Many lodging housekeepers paid them to keep order. Though order usually meant silence bought with threats, women played their part too. Some gangs had female fighters known as hussies or mollies, who wielded broken bottles and heavy boots with as much fury as the men. Their loyalty was fierce, and their wrath even fiercer. To the poor, gangs were both curse and protection. If you paid them, they might guard your stall or keep rival thieves away. If you defied them, your windows were smashed, your goods stolen, and your life left hanging by a thread. Children were pulled into gangs almost as soon as they could fight. Many orphans found their only family in these groups, learning to steal, brawl, and obey their leaders. Violence became their inheritance. The police called them ruffians and street terrorists, but few constables dared to face them head-on. Some officers were bribed to look the other way. Others were beaten so badly they never patrolled the same streets again. By the late 1800s, entire districts were divided like war zones. Step into the wrong alley wearing the wrong scarf, and you might never walk out. The gang's power was law, and law was survival. The newspapers fed the legend. Headlines screamed of bloody clashes, of policemen left half dead, of respectable gentlemen robbed in broad daylight. Londoners read with horror, yet secretly thrilled at the tales of violence lurking so close to home. Reformers saw gangs as proof of the city's decay. They argued that poverty, hunger, and hopelessness bred these armies of the streets. But the gangs themselves cared little for debate. They thrived in the cracks society left behind. Some gangs became so bold, they operated almost openly. Taverns flew their colors, markets tolerated their presence, and even politicians feared their influence. Behind closed doors, rumors spread of gang leaders cutting deals with the very men sworn to stop them. In dark corners of Whitechapel and Limehouse, whispers spoke of gangs not just fighting each other, but dabbling in darker trades, trafficking women, running opium dens, and even disposing of bodies in the river or the sewers. For ordinary Londoners, the gangs were a constant shadow. A walk home at night was a gamble, a coin toss between reaching your door safely or vanishing into the alleyways forever. And though the police tried, passing new laws and building more prisons, the gangs never truly vanished. They adapted, shifting their crimes, blending into the city's endless crowd. By the time the century ended, the gangs had etched themselves into London's history, a reminder that beneath the empire's polished crown lay streets where survival belonged not to the righteous, but to the ruthless. And as these gangs ruled the living, whispers began of a final, unholy secret, that perhaps the devil himself had once walked among them, the devil's final footprint in a city already drowning in crime. poverty, and shadows, there came a story so strange, so chilling, that many refused to believe it, but others swore it was true, that the devil himself had left his mark on Victorian London. The tale begins on a frozen morning in February 1855. Snow had fallen thick across the English countryside, blanketing villages in silence. But when dawn broke, villagers stepped outside to find something unnatural pressed into the snow. They weren't the footprints of men, nor the paws of dogs. They were cloven, like the hooves of a goat. Neat, sharp, and perfectly spaced, they stretched for miles across fields, rooftops, and even walls. People whispered in terror. Only one being could walk in such a way. Only one being could leave such a trail. The devil. Though most of the tracks appeared in Devon, rumors soon reached London. The city buzzed with fear. If Satan could stalk the countryside, what was stopping him from entering the fog-filled alleys of the capital itself? Superstitions spread quickly in a city already plagued with misery. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Priests thundered from pulpits, and even hardened criminals glanced nervously at the ground when night fog rolled in. Some said they saw the marks in London's East End, hooves pressed into the filthy snow outside lodging houses, winding their way into graveyards, stopping at freshly dug earth. Others told of encounters far stranger. A man walking home late claimed to see a tall figure, cloaked and horned, vanish into the mist, leaving behind a stench of brimstone. He swore the sound of hooves echoed on the cobblestones. For a city already haunted by murderers like Jack the Ripper and gangs who ruled with knives, the thought of Satan walking among them was almost too much to bear. And yet the stories grew. Newspapers reported sightings, sometimes mockingly, sometimes with open dread. One article asked if London's sins, its brothels, gin dens, and crimes had summoned hell itself to the empire's heart. Policemen, though skeptical, admitted unease. Some constables swore they saw hoof-like tracks near the Thames on icy mornings. They laughed it off in public, but in private, they crossed themselves before patrol. To the poor, the devil was not just a story. He was a presence. In the flicker of gaslight on a foggy night, in the scream that rang out before silence, in the shadow that lingered just too long on a wall, there was always the question, was it him? Religious leaders claimed it was punishment. London, they said, was a city of greed, lust, and cruelty. Perhaps these footprints were a warning, a reminder that hell waited just below the surface. Scientists tried to explain it away as animal tracks, as hoaxes, as tricks of the snow. But no matter the arguments, the fear remained. People remembered the chill of those stories more than the logic that tried to erase them. In time, the rumors blended with the city's other horrors. Jack the Ripper, the gangs, the lodging houses, all seemed part of a greater evil, a sense that London itself was cursed ground. To this day, some believe the devil walked in Victorian London, that his cloven hooves pressed into the same stones as carriages and beggars, leaving a mark no street cleaner could wash away. Whether true or not, the legend became one last haunting chapter in the city's hidden history. For in Victorian London, the devil didn't need to appear in flesh to be real. He lived in the poverty, the crime, the cruelty, and the darkness of human hearts. And so, the devil's final footprint wasn't in the snow at all. It was in London itself, a city of grandeur and filth, of riches and rot, where the line between man and monster blurred until it was impossible to tell where humanity ended and hell began.